So Nietzsche, okay, and what he's going to do, remember what Marx said. Marx said there is no God, right? And both he and Nietzsche are going to assume some of the same things, that God doesn't exist and we're not accountable to him. Marx was more concerned about economics and political solutions. So Marx was more concerned about, let's have a revolution, let's let the workers of the ruling of the world unite and cast off the shackles of their capitalist overlords, the bourgeoisie, and have them now be equal. This great leveler where everybody's equal to each according to his needs, right? You've heard those sort of quotes. Okay, that sound really, really good. Nietzsche is going to say, all right, all you polite atheists, all you people that think that religion is just kind of just this thing you do on Sundays, I'm going to call you out on it. You don't understand the implications of what's going on. This is where we get the really famous line. Everybody heard this before? God is dead and we have killed him. Have you ever heard that? That's Nietzsche. Why? And he doesn't mean what you think he means. He's actually terrified. Because what he's going to say is, do you understand, atheists, what this actually means, that God is dead? You're acting like you can still be these moral, respectable individuals who can rest on all these centuries of civilization and still be in polite society, even though you don't believe in God. He's going to say, it's not good enough. You don't understand the full implications of your beliefs. You're not being strong enough. You're being wimpy about this. The real man, the Superman, the Ubermensch, now, because there is no God, is now God. And he doesn't mean that as in a transcendent God. He's using it as in you can construct and take the bull by the horns, your own reality, and take control of your own life. Okay, that's Nietzsche. And he's very, very fun. He's actually, if you can read a good translation, he's kind of fun to read because he's so impassioned and he tells all these stories and he tells lots of parables and you're going to get a couple of them in the Truman work that we're going to watch here in just a second. But Nietzsche's a fascinating character, brilliant dude, also crazy. He ends up having several nervous breakdowns and mental breakdowns because he is so amped up, and he really just kind of is, like I said, really interesting individual in general. Another reason why people know Nietzsche is some of his teachings were co-opted, and you can argue whether or not this was legitimate or not. Most would say illegitimate, but some would say maybe not. His writings were also co-opted by the Nazis in the 20th century, and the concept of the Übermensch, the Superman, the Übermensch, right? The idea that we're going to create a more strong and robust society. And you'll hear people, saying only human beings are the people that let their weak ones survive. The idea that Christianity is for wimps, that's Nietzsche, okay? Because Christianity is telling you those lusts and those envies that you feel, that you should suppress those. That's wimpy. A true Übermensch figures out how to fulfill those things. See? And so Nietzsche's going to come into this as a big deal. And he kind of sums up. And the reason we are using these figures, it's not so much when I give you this, and I know Truman would agree with me on this, it's not so much that all these individual thinkers, you need to memorize them or something. The reason we have these thinkers included is to show you that ideas have consequences. And so it's not so much that you need to know who Nietzsche is, or you need to know who Rousseau is, or you need to memorize all these little facts. The point of these individuals is to show you that the way they think about reality, the way they think about life, or the way they think about religion or Christianity is impactful to us today. That's the number one thing that you need to understand. So when you look at the world, hence why understanding the times, when you look at the world and people say things about Christianity, then you see this in Nietzsche. I'm going to tell you a quick story. This fascinates me. So one of our graduates from Grace High School, and actually I can say her name because she sometimes watches my class and she'll love that I'm talking about her. One of last year's seniors, Ashley Snell. Do you recognize? Some of you might know the redheaded girl. She goes to ISU. Okay, she's laughing at this.
Redheaded girl.
The redheaded girl. Well, because she embodies that personality very well. I'll just say that. She does. Everybody that knows her, knows Ash, knows that she fits a lot of stereotypes there, and she's good with it. But anyways, she's at ISU, and she has met, and I kid you not, Norse pagans at ISU. People that believe in Thor and Odin, and they're all really ripped, big white guys. Why are they attracted to it? Because it's a religion of strength. Because they think Christianity is just a religion for wimps, or a religion for the lower classes, or that it's just to make people feel good, or it's a feminized religion, or you're going to hear all these criticisms. And so then you got a religion where like Thor is like the macho man. You see how like a 19-something male who doesn't believe in anything would embrace something like that, even if he knows deep down it's kind of silly. He still embraces the culture. Do you see why? She's met several Norse pagans. She invited one of them to church. But I mean, that shows you. But I mean, it shows you the attraction. Nietzsche would have been all about it, because he said if that would have given you a sense of meaning, a sense of transcendence for yourself, that you can seize life for what it is. You see what I mean? Now he would have said, I'm an atheist, so he wouldn't have believed in those deities, but he would have understood the reason for it. The idea of I want something that's strength, that's greater than me, an Übermensch, and that's basically what they are. They're Supermen, right? Thor, Odin, all those people. And I found that fascinating. That so here she is. I think she Instagrammed me. She's like, you'll never guess who I met today, a Norse pagan. And it was just the most bizarre comment. And I was like, how many of them are there? And she said, there's a few, there's several. They're actually really nice. I was like, I'm sure they are. so it's funny, and so those of you who know Ash, you guys are kind of chuckling because you know her personality, you know how this conversation probably went. This is a good conversation, and she won't mind that I mention her as far as things goes. But that's a great example of these ideas, because if you believe like Nietzsche that Christianity is just a religion of weakness, or it's just a way to like avoid who you really are, it's this stuff above it, right? Then you can attach yourself to something that gives you strength and a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose. Nietzsche would have said that that's not necessarily the best way of doing it. He would have said that even that's a cop-out. Because if God is dead, you don't need small gods either. You just need yourself. So he would have said that's a cop-out, but he would have at least understood the reasons in terms of Christianity's for whims. That's how they think about things. As far as the average everyday person, that it's a religion for the lower classes, a religion for the slaves. That was a very popular view for really over 100 years in most colleges. So let's look at Nietzsche. You have the outline in front of you. I kind of gave you a little bit of an introduction about the introduction to Nietzsche, but this will continue with Carl Trueman here. Here we go. And I'll probably pause it just to make sure that we're on the same page. I think I have to fast forward if I remember. Let's see if I do or not. Yeah. There we go.
The purpose of this short series of lectures, as I stated in the very first one, is to offer some kind of historical, intellectual, cultural background to many of the ways we intuitively think today. I want to reflect in this particular lecture on the influence of Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher. When we think about modern society, when we think about modern culture, numerous things perhaps come to mind. Our world is marked by rampant individualism, the emphasis upon individual rights, individual freedoms, the ability to be whoever we want to be. It's also marked by relativism, the idea that my view is no better, no worse than your view. There are no absolutes out there. There's a sense in which we can invent morality for ourselves. There's also a deep suspicion, is there not, of power. The idea that somehow those in power are out to manipulate us. Those who have power are seen as wicked. There's a sense in which the weak have become the heroes of history. And there's the notion that religion is not just false, but positively harmful. In fact, we met that idea in the work of Karl Marx in the very last lecture I gave in this series. Well, all of these things, rampant individualism, relativism, suspicion of power, the notion that religion is positively harmful, all of these things are anticipated in the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. His dates are 1844 to 1900, though he spent the last decade of his life in a state of permanent mental breakdown. Marginally in his own time, Nietzsche's ideas, along with those of Marx and Freud, who we'll meet in a later lecture, have shaped modern thinking in profound ways, and also, indeed, modern institutions. His ideas are pervasive and profound, and indeed, we might say, intuitive to many of us today. We take a whole lecture series to deal in any way adequately with the thought and the contribution of Friedrich Nietzsche, but I want to focus today on one particular aspect of his thinking that's of relevance to the overall narrative of this course, and that is his attack on religion, which perhaps surprisingly, given his status as a leading philosopher, was also an attack on the polite and sophisticated atheism that was espoused by many Enlightenment thinkers. Like Marx, Nietzsche was interested in the psychology of religion. And by that, what I mean is its social function, why it grips the imagination of so many people. He assumed, like Marx did, that the Enlightenment had successfully rendered traditional Christianity to be an impossible option for intelligent, thinking human beings. And that provided the background then to his assault on religion in his own day. It's worth noting, though, before we jump in to look at some of his ideas, that his writings are quite distinctive. For much of his life, he suffered from considerable ill health. And therefore, a lot of his philosophy is written in aphoristic form, short, pithy, pungent paragraphs. He's also one of those philosophers who is very literary in his approach. There are philosophers who can be very tedious and dry to read. Well, Nietzsche's not one of those. He's a literary philosopher. He writes with a flair that makes his writings appeal even to those who are not professional philosophers. Much of his thinking is told in the form of stories and parables that make the reader sit back and think, that challenge us at the deepest level in terms of our own beliefs and commitments. And what I want to do today is focus on just two passages in one of his major books, The Gay Science. The Gay Science, or sometimes it's translated as The Joyful Knowledge. The Gay Science was published first in 1882 and then in 1887. And the two passages I've chosen both take us to the heart of Nietzsche's attack on religion and the challenge of a post-religious future. Like Marx, Nietzsche was not simply interested in dismissing and getting rid of religion. He wanted to raise the question of what that meant for human beings in what we might call a post-religious world.
So that's that blank under B. What will the post-religious world look like? And then the blank above that, of course, the gay science and the joyful knowledge. That was back when that word actually meant what that meant, right? Joyful, happy, enlightened, that sort of thing, okay? So just to kind of go back to A, if you're following along. So it's an attack on religion and also an attack on the polite and respectable atheism of the time. And according to him and Marx, all of Christianity and religion as a whole has been discredited by the Enlightenment, okay? Some other books by him, you don't have to write these down, but he also wrote one called Ecce Homo, Behold the Man. Is another one. You're going to get a quote from that at the very end. He also wrote a book called Also Sprach Zarathustra, or also Thus Spoke Zoroaster. He makes like these religious allusions. So Ecce Homo is what Pilate says to Jesus, behold the man, when he shows them, right? And so he's using religious allegories from around the world. He talks about Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Buddhism. You're going to get a Buddhist reference in a second. He tries to use all of these religions in a way to kind of illustrate his overall points. But if you've ever heard his books, right? One is actually just called The Antichrist, one of his books. It's called The Antichrist. But he also has Ecce Homo, Behold the Man, Also Sprach Zarathustra, or Thus Spoke Zoroaster. He's just got all these different books. He's very, very popular in some circles. He's kind of considered existentialist in that he's talking about the nature of life and how we know things as far as things go. But there's an angst and a passion and an almost maniacal energy in Nietzsche that makes him really attractive to some, or at least fascinating to read. So many philosophy majors, when they go to college, they'll read Nietzsche and they're like, "Oh, I love Nietzsche." You know, and he's kind of a trendy thing, especially when you're young, because he has an energy and he kind of speaks to your angst in some ways that you feel about society. So you can understand his attraction as far as things go. And so there's answers to Nietzsche, but I just want to let you know that he's still popular. People still read it in philosophy departments in particular. We're going to add.
I just saw that on a website I saw. He was the son of a Lutheran pastor.
Yeah.
And grew up in going to Christian school. I think that's very interesting to know that he then flipped.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The other side, yeah.
Yeah. Some of the more effective people are people that got either they had a trauma of some kind or they were never given answers. You'd be amazed how many people, and actually this is, and I don't know about Nietzsche because I don't like know it like all aspects of his biography, but you'd be amazed how many skeptics that originally started out in the church, the number one reason they give you, actually they give it 2 or 3 reasons. One is hypocrisy. They'll say there's a bunch of hypocrites, which is everybody's a hypocrite. That's true. It's how you teach that, right? You're right, everybody's a hypocrite because we're all sinners. So it's how you teach that. Okay, but especially in very legalistic churches, you know, where it's like all about following the rules, you can see how that'd be a turnoff if you see hypocrites, right? So hypocrisy is one of the number one reasons. Another reason is unanswered questions. that the church doesn't know how to answer, or they'll say things, well, it's just a matter of faith. You just got to believe it. And so for thinking individuals, that's offensive, right? It's like, you mean I have to forget my brain when I become a Christian? And so they get offended by that. And then they discover somebody like Nietzsche or Bart Ehrman's works on the reliability of scripture or whatever it is, and that fires them up and they leave the church, right? And then the third one is some sort of trauma. They had a leader or a trusted individual who abused them in some way or disappointed them in some way, right? Those are the main three reasons you'll see: hypocrisy, unanswered questions, or some sort of trauma experience that either an authority figure or somebody close next to them, and then therefore everything's bad, right? So that's one of those things that you get, one of those three reasons, or sometimes a combination of them. You know, they experience one thing and then they say, why did this happen to me? And again, there's no answers, you know. I mean, so you can put all those are the number three, those are the three reasons that people leave Christianity. And most of them have decided to leave by the time they are in middle school. I don't know if you know that. I don't know if you've ever seen those data. There've been numerous studies done that most people that leave the church have decided to do so in their early teens, like 14, 13.
That's about, my mom was Catholic, and that's about the time she was 13 when she told her grandmother they were all hypocrites and she wasn't going anymore.
Yeah. And if they still go, it's because they're obeying their parents, or it's part of their culture or something. But once they're in college or out on their own, they quit. Most kids decide to leave in middle school, or maybe early high school. So I think 13 to 15 range. Almost all data, American Research Group, other groups have done surveys on this. And why do you leave? All those lists that I just gave you. I also like to point out for people, notice that they didn't leave because they didn't have enough youth programs. They didn't leave because they had, you know what I'm saying? We like to somehow say, well, if we just had a more cool youth group, or if we just had if our band was like a rock band, then the youth would stay. Notice the things that they're talking about: answers to questions, genuine lived out faith. You see what they're actually looking for? They're looking for real Christianity. They're not looking for programs and gimmicks. They're looking for real Christianity. So that's something, just to throw that out there for you, it's something you may not know. But Nietzsche, so the reason I bring that up is because Darren brought that up. Nietzsche was the son of a minister. Marx also was connected. He was Jewish, but I think it was his grandpa was a rabbi or something like that. And he actually became atheistic and actually, quote unquote, made a deal with the devil. There's actually a book out there called The Devil and Karl Marx. Came out a couple years ago, because he was so anti-religion. Nietzsche is different because Nietzsche is a little bit more about the implications of belief. So he's not quite he doesn't have the same anger level that Marx has, but they're similar in that way. Anyways, let's go to Nietzsche. I gotta let this keep going. It's a great, interesting discussion, but do know there's data. If you want the data, I can find it for you sometime about when people decide to leave the church and why. I have the surveys for that. It's pretty interesting.
The first paragraph is from this work is number 108. Reads as follows: the shadow of the Buddha. After Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too. A piece of classic Nietzsche in many ways. The meaning is not immediately obvious. There's this idea that there is this cave. Buddha has died, but for some reason his shadow remains on the wall of the cave and terrifies those who come to visit it. And then Nietzsche moves on and says, you know, God is dead, but his shadow remains. And the task of getting rid of that shadow rests on the shoulders of us. The point, if you like, is in some ways a relatively simple one. The influence of Buddha lived long after his own death. And the influence of Buddha, therefore, continued from Nietzsche's perspective to exert a dark and negative influence on human beings long after the Buddha himself had passed from this mortal coil. This paragraph sets the stage for Nietzsche's critique of religion. The point that Nietzsche wants to make is this: the Enlightenment, David Hume, Immanuel Kant and company, they may have got rid of God or reduced him to something that's very, very small and irrelevant. But the influence of God, specifically, as we shall see, the morality built upon the idea of God, persists and must be vanquished if man is to be truly free. This is why elsewhere in his writings, Nietzsche will refer to Immanuel Kant as the spider. He portrays the great Enlightenment philosopher as a spider sitting at the center of a metaphysical web that is used to justify Christian morality, even as he himself has got rid of the Christian God. The idea for Nietzsche is that's not enough. It's not enough to get rid of God. One has to get rid of everything that is built or has ever been built or founded upon the existence of God as well. Christianity may be unviable by Enlightenment standards. Well, everybody accepts that as far as Nietzsche is concerned. But they must take the next step and therefore get rid of everything that was built upon the Christian religion. Nietzsche is, if you like, calling the bluff of the Enlightenment, telling the great Enlightenment philosophers that they could not have their cake and eat it. They could not get rid of God and yet retain, if you like, the world that religion had made. For Nietzsche, the Enlightenment commitment to some form of metaphysics was but the residue of religion, a religion that had long ago lost its credibility. And that sets the stage for the second passage, a much longer passage that I want to read, the dramatic entry of Nietzsche.
So before we get to that, just to kind of get the blanks here. So the first passage, God is dead, but his shadow remains. The influence of Buddha continued long after death. And then the Enlightenment may have gotten rid of God, but the influence of God, especially morality, persists and must be vanquished in order for man to be truly free. So what Nietzsche is doing is he's calling the Enlightenment philosophers bluff. They didn't go far enough. And so what he's saying is, and you've heard this before, people still do this. Richard Dawkins does this. Richard Dawkins is the famous atheist from England, one of the new atheists. I can't remember which interview this was. I don't know if it was for like The Guardian or for the Times of London or something, where he basically admitted that he doesn't want Christianity, but he wants the benefits of Christianity. Like he admits it. So in other words, I don't believe. I'm not a believer. And he's very militant that people that reject, kind of like atheistic evolution as their worldview are stupid or ignorant. Like he'll say that. However, he still wants Christian culture and Christian morality. Nietzsche says not good enough. Nietzsche's calling that bluff. He's basically saying you're not going far enough. There's more to it than that, because this is what I do appreciate about Nietzsche is he understands that remember, ideas have consequences, right? There's an implication to your worldview, and if your worldview has killed God, hence you're going to get the famous quote here in just this next one. If your worldview has killed God, then why are you living like he still exists? See, at least he's consistent. At least he realizes the inconsistencies for many of these kind of popular, genteel atheists of the time. And so, well, I'm an atheist, but I'll give you a great example. There's a French composer named Camille Saint-Saëns. He wrote the Carnival of the Animals. Have you ever heard the Carnival of the Animals? It's a famous piece. People use it for music appreciation to identify all the instruments. So there's a roaring lion and there's fossils and there's all these cool things. So the Carnival of the Animals. Camille Saint-Saëns was an atheist, but he was a church organist, wrote religious music, was considered part of polite society, was an ambassador for the French government, but he was an atheist. Somebody like that would have driven Nietzsche crazy, because he would have said, what are you wasting your life on? If you think this is false, why are you working in the church when you could just be your own church? If you're an atheist, why are you working for the French government that's still tied in with the Catholic Church so much? And, now granted, this is after the revolution, so not as much as before, but still representing that sort of thing. They're the ruling class of society. They just want to keep their power. Why are you allying yourself with them? Camille, you're wasting your life here. God is dead. Don't you realize this? You see what he means? And you got to understand the passion of Nietzsche on this. He almost views himself as a sort of prophet. Like I was born too early, that sort of thing, because people don't realize the implications of their beliefs. And so I want you to understand the passion of Nietzsche. And again, why people today that are either atheists or struggling or coming out of the faith and they've had trauma or whatever it is, they read Nietzsche and they're like, I fell in my spirit, brother. This is why. Okay, so here, let's get to the famous passage. He quotes this at length, and then he'll explain it. But it's a pretty amazing story. You'll see the passion here.
Nietzsche's madman. I quote, "Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning stars, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, 'I seek God, I seek God'? As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. 'Has he got lost?' asked one. 'Did he lose his way like a child?' asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage, emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. Where is God? He cried. I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? God's too decomposed. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us for the sake of this deed, he will belong to our higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It has been related further that on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches, and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Led out and called to account, he said, always to have replied nothing but, what after all are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God? I quote the passage at length because, as the Nietzsche scholar Stephen Williams comments, it's one of those passages that to make comment on almost domesticates it and reduces it. Nietzsche, I think, never wrote a finer or more expressive and powerful passage than that. But at the risk of domesticating it, it is worth us spending a few moments reflecting on what he claims in this passage. First, he claims that God and theism are finished. That point had been made by Hume. Kant, of course, saw God as important simply in his assumption, not as a knowable reality. But Nietzsche now demands that Enlightenment philosophers truly face up to what they have done. God is not simply the case that God does not exist. Enlightenment philosophy has killed him. Many know, second point, many know this, but few appreciate what it really means. Notice how he says at the beginning, as many of those who did not believe in God, the madman is after the atheists at this point, were standing around just then. Has he got lost? Asked one, etc., etc. Notice, these are the men who deny God's existence, but don't understand the significance of what they have done. And yet Nietzsche, the next point one might say, draw from Nietzsche is this. This is of unimaginable significance. The death of God, the taking away of God, is of unimaginable significance. It demands that everything is changed. Nothing that was built on God. The idea that the world has meaning, the idea that there is such a thing as morality, none of these things can survive the death of God. Everything needs to be changed. And that leads, next point, to a tremendous sense of what we might describe as existential vertigo. The images Nietzsche uses are powerful, aren't they? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually backward, sideward, forward in all directions? Is there still any up or down? There's a feeling of existential vertigo that kicks in. What is stable anymore? What can be relied upon? Where is truth to be found? All of these things have gone with the killing of God. And Nietzsche demands that the polite Enlightenment atheists face the significance of what they have done. And that's terrifying. It's terrifying, isn't it? The madman says, how shall we comfort ourselves? The murderers of all murderers, those who have profaned the holiest, those who have committed a crime unimaginable in its significance and its implications. Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? And that takes us to an interesting ambiguity, I think, at the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche's philosophy here is both triumphant and terrifying. There is the triumphant declaration of the triumph of the death of God, the triumph of the Enlightenment's polemic against traditional theism and Christianity, and yet an acknowledgement that that brings in its wake real terror. Is that not a characteristic in many ways of our own modern age? When you think about it, we want to be free. Everybody wants to be free to express ourselves and to be ourselves. And yet we also live in a world where, though we have greater potential for realizing that freedom than any previous generation, we see catastrophic levels of anxiety, even of teen suicide. All our affluence and all our technological power over our own destinies brings with it chilling responsibility. I sometimes in class sometimes I do this quite a lot. I ask my students to invent their own paper questions and answer them for the credit for the module. It's interesting that every year, quite a number of the students find that uncomfortable. Here I am, giving them the freedom to design a question that they can answer. And yet they would much rather not have that freedom and that responsibility. They'd much rather have the professor do it for them at that level. Nietzsche grasps something very profound in this passage, and that is freedom can be a very terrifying thing, as our current society and culture witnesses to. And yet Nietzsche is also in this passage pushing the fact that humanity must rise to the challenge. If God is dead, then human beings must become gods. What does he mean by that? They must invent themselves. There's no teleology now. There's no end, transcendent end for human beings as far as Nietzsche is concerned. There is no great sacred purpose in life beyond this for Nietzsche. We must invent our own meanings, he demands at this point. We have to invent our own worlds. We have to invent our own morals. The greatest human for Nietzsche is the one who transcends himself, who rises to that challenge, who creates himself and his own identity. In other words, going back to the language we used in the very first class, we might say that psychology and the expressive individual, these serve us as we make ourselves gods in our own life. We are those who are called to move beyond ourselves as far as Nietzsche is concerned and be whatever we want to be. Don't be what the crowd makes us. Be what we ourselves have decided to be. That's the challenge for Nietzsche of the death of God. No other philosopher, I think, understands the radical implications of atheism for the way we think about the world and the way we organize our lives, the way we understand ourselves to be, better than Friedrich Nietzsche. And that brings me latterly to this. Nietzsche himself set the stage for the rise of what we might call the modern expressive individual. Nietzsche set the stage for what we have all around us today, the idea that we can invent ourselves, just do it, be whatever we want to be. He set the stage for the man who I want to look at in the next class, who epitomized perhaps more than anything else Nietzsche's ideal of what a human being should be, the Irish playwright and poet Oscar Wilde. But as I said at the start of this class, Nietzsche was little thought of in his own day. His works did not sell well. He had struggled finding a publisher. Yet his ideas have come to permeate the way we think about the world in which we live. And in a strange way, Nietzsche himself almost seems to have prophesied this in one of the last books that he wrote before his final descent into total madness. It was an autobiography, Ecce Homo, Behold the Man. He wrote this in the months approaching his final breakdown. And this is what he said about his own significance. And it's with these words that I end. I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous, a crisis without equal on earth, the most profound collision of conscience, a decision that was conjured up against everything that had been believed, demanded, and hallowed so far. I am no man. I am dynamite.
What do you think of Nietzsche? You see why people might be attracted to him? He has an energy and a passion in his writing, and if you feel like you could create your own reality, he's kind of like a prophet for you in terms of like your own reality. Okay, and so some of the blanks, if you didn't catch this, let's just go through these quickly just to make sure you're on the same page. God is dead, and we have killed him. And in this parable of the madman, Nietzsche believes that even atheists aren't ready to be consistent and truly live out their beliefs. This leads to existential vertigo, is the word he uses. What is stable anymore? What is up? What is down? Have we unchained the earth from the sun? Are we going in 1,000 different directions? Does that not reflect how many young people view life today right now? I don't know what to do. I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know my own identity. I don't know, because I have no sense of transcendent meaning in my life, and and even things like my identity, depending on your identity, cultural Marxism, you might be the enemy without any choices on your own, right? You might just be the enemy just because of the class you're in or whatever. So the point is that there's this existential angst, existential vertigo that people feel. And so that's one of the reasons I think some Christians like me were attracted to more traditional liturgical churches is because they're stable. Because it's not based on my own personal experiences. It's something that transcends time and space. There's something comforting about, hey, we've been doing this for 2,000 years, as opposed to, oh, this is the latest and greatest thing. Do you know what I mean? That's why people like me are attracted to, that's why when I came out of a Baptist seminary, I said I'm either Lutheran, Anglican, Catholic, or Orthodox. Think about all four of those traditions. See what I mean? There's a stability there and a respect for the past, and there's a heritage and a culture that I was attracted to. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. I think it's true for other reasons, but that's one of the reasons I wanted that stability, because without that stability, it's this. It's Nietzsche. How do I know, where's up, where's down, right? You can see that, okay? Even for Nietzsche, this is terrifying. That's the blank there, unimaginable. And so humanity must rise to the challenge and now must become gods, with a small g, of course. Human beings must now invent themselves. There is no great sacred purpose in life. And since all that exists is nature, and traditional sources of morality and virtue have been eliminated, man must now become his own god, or Übermensch. That's the Nietzsche term. And take it, seize the day, be strong about things. There was another video that I almost showed you, but there was a unfortunate graphic in it that I couldn't show in broadcast because it was like this pinup girl, and they were using it as an illustration, and I couldn't. Okay, but it was from something called The Philosophy of Life, and it's somebody who sympathizes with Nietzsche, not a Christian, but there's some really telling things in this video, and one of the things it mentions is, instead of saying, oh, that I shouldn't do that because I'm envious and that's a problem with me. Nope, that envy means that you're not living your true life yet. So what can you do to solve that envy you're feeling right now so you can have that stuff? Because after all, there's no transcendent source of meaning, so seize the day, get it for you now. See what I mean? So Nietzsche has an attraction for folks because he speaks to that need that people feel, that angst, and he gives people a sense of purpose, even if it is just the self. And now you wonder why people are depressed and have anxiety and all these other things. Truman points that out. Look at teen suicide rates and anxiety rates. I show my students this data when we talk about American government. I'll show it to this Sunday school class at some point too. Things like suicide rates, divorce rates, marriage rates, and all this stuff since the 1950s and 60s. Pretty sobering stuff.
And you know why Nietzsche went crazy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you can hear it even in his writing, right? Even if you hear him, I am dynamite, you can hear this almost unhinged nature to his writing, but yet he's onto something.
Yeah.
He's onto something. He realizes the implication of, right? And so you can understand why some people sympathize with him or are attracted to him, because he's like, hey, I may be going crazy right now, but at least I'm genuine.
And if he hadn't gone crazy, would he have turned back God?
I don't know. I mean, you'd have to. I mean, for me personally, if you haven't heard the sermon yet, the authority of God's word and also the historic nature of Jesus' resurrection is what kept me in the faith. That regardless of how I'm feeling at any moment, I know that Jesus rose from the dead, and I know His word is true. I couldn't doubt those things. I doubt everything else. But for Nietzsche, that was not. The Enlightenment had done away with that stuff. So he had nothing. He truly had nothing to come back to. So it's hard to speculate, what would have saved him, It's kind of a sad story, but also just, again, a fascinating read. And again, I recommend reading broadly, just so you know what we're dealing with. So if that appeals to you, or if you want to read more about Nietzsche, he's really easy to find because he's very popular. But again, very much influential in the modern self. All right, I got to preach, so I need to go over there. Let's go ahead and send a blessing on ourselves. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make His face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up His countenance upon us and give us peace. Amen.